In 2016, Disney released Moana to a mostly, yeah, that was alright sort of reaction. Its $248 million box office was no slouch, but well under the $400 million raised by Frozen. And how far I'll go did it become the Baby Shark level, kill me now if you ever play it again, sort of hit that Let It Go did. However, on Disney Plus, Moana would have huge legs, like giraffe level. According to Nielsen ratings, audiences have watched 80 billion minutes worth of it, which equates to watching it 748 million times. Just a few more times than my kids have. Further Nielsen data shows it's also been one of the 4 most watched films on any streaming service on a yearly basis for the past decade. And turns out, slapping a 2 on a beloved Disney property is still a license to print money, so Moana 2 made bank. Of course, it was bound to work, being the brainchild of directors Ron Clements and John Musker, who put the whole Disney renaissance into motion with The Little Mermaid, bringing Disney back from the box office abyss of such films as The Black Cauldron and The Fox and the Hound. But The Little Mermaid didn't just splash out of nowhere. It wasn't even their first film with Disney. The honor of that title goes to... Yeah, Disney was sort of going through a phase back then with their titles. Like, recently with the one-word states of being, Frozen, Tangled, Onward, Brave. In the 1980s, it was all about describing nouns. The Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, and The Great Mouse Detective. Back in 1986...
The year is 1986. 1986. That's way ahead.
The Great Mouse Detective was generally met with positive reviews from critics and fans, and it made a moderately decent amount at the box office.
Because I haven't liked a Disney animated feature in more than a decade. I know you liked The Rescuers back in the 70s. I didn't care for that, or The Black Cauldron. I thought a lot of their pictures have lately been dark and dreary, and this was upbeat and bright and intelligent and didn't talk down to kids.
However, it's not nearly at the level of Clements and Musker's hits like Moana, Mermaid, and Aladdin, or even as noted as Hercules. It hasn't even merited an uninspired live-action remake, a sort of strange backhanded reprieve. But does it deserve its obscure status among the Disney animated films? Well, sorta? I mean, it's understandable if you look at the film, but that doesn't mean I don't really enjoy it. Let's explore. There are many distinctive features to admire about The Great Mouse Detective artistically. This film stands out, particularly at that stage in Disney animated film history. However, as you could tell the creators of Cop Rock, when you break the mold, you can create problems for yourself. Starting off the interesting choices, the story centers around an adult male character. Now, while Pixar would eventually have a lot of them, this was not terribly common for the Disney canon at the time. In fact, only 14% of Disney animated films had adult male leads up to that point, and that's if you count Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which was a package feature, or Mr. Toad as an adult rather than just some sort of man-child. So basically, Pongo and Robin Hood. And unlike those films, there's no romantic plot whatsoever. Now, about 35% of all Disney animated films up to that point avoided a romance plot, but most of them were centered around child characters like Dumbo or Pinocchio. The Great Mouse Detective was really the first Disney movie to have an adult character who didn't have hearts popping in their eyes by the end. This makes Basil a more interesting character in some regards, but it also creates a problem. You see, romance is an easy motivation to get behind. When Pongo desperately tries to find himself a mate, basic animal instincts, I mean, we get it. One of the reasons why Basil doesn't quite strike the same chord is that his motivation to put Ratigan behind bars seems like a bland intellectual exercise. When he describes his long-running feud with him, it comes across less like Simba seeking to avenge his father's death and more like Dwight Schrute and Jim sparring in the office. While you certainly feel bad for Olivia and you want Ratigan defeated for kidnapping her father, she's not the main character, and she's, well, cloyingly cute? Basil just doesn't have the same central motivation. This is most clear in the poor excuse for the film's Dark Night of the Soul moment, when Basil just gives up. Again, it's an intellectual defeat. I just can't. Someone bested me. Not enough likes on my profile. He's just mad Ratigan got the upper hand. Audiences tend to respond better to deeper emotional appeals, like Dead Dads, for example. Now, some might say, well, isn't another problem that he's sort of arrogant and curmudgeon-y? Don't think so. While Carl Fredricksen is not a character kids are storming to get autographs for, the movie Up is certainly a greater part of the Disney canon due to the emotional hook. We care about Carl settling his unfinished emotional baggage from his wife's death. Similar with Marlin and Nemo. Okay, I keep bringing up death, and no, I'm not suggesting that Disney should have had Basil's wife die at the hands of Ratigan in some tragic accident, but we needed something beyond a frenemy grudge to pay off the ending. Ultimately, what does Basil learn? He goes from being a solo act to a partnership, but the movie doesn't really go out of its way to set up his loneliness, how he needs a friend. In fact, it seems like Dawson is way more excited about joining him. Now, Clements and Musker would rectify this problem in their later work. Ariel wants to be human. Aladdin wants respect and to matter. Moana wants to discover her true identity. Hercules wants to be a god. Okay, so they didn't quite completely fix the problem. But in the classic canon, motivations are clear and are great hooks. And speaking of hooks, the openings are dramatically better at catching your attention. You might think that an action-packed kidnapping of a girl's father would be a hook, and it is, but it's not nearly the compelling opening of the reveal of an undersea world in The Little Mermaid leading to a compelling shark chase. A mystical comedic storyteller sets up an intense scene where a giant cave speaks of a chosen one, or evil ink smudges draining the island of all their life. In other words, the world building just isn't there. Now I understand Great Mouse Detective more or less is set in the normal world, but we don't have a scope of how dangerous Ratigan is. What's at stake if he's not stopped? And while we feel for Olivia, again, she's not ultimately the main character. As an aside, the whole idea of a prologue to a Disney movie would have been unusual for the time. The closest thing to a prologue seen in a Disney animated film before was The Rescuers, which was all the few seconds to see Penny throw a bottle off a creepy steamboat. First impressions matter, and while this hook isn't terrible, it just isn't on the level of the Disney greats. Before Great Mouse Detective, Disney had two categories of film: distinctly musicals and distinctly not a musical. And before you think that not being a musical was a death knell because, well, The Black Cauldron, 101 Dalmatians is one of Disney's most successful films box office-wise and features only diegetic songs that make sense in the universe of the movie. In one of the cheapest and easiest writer shortcut ways to include songs, Roger is a songwriter. The rescuers Mice in the UN sing their little ditty, and in Bambi the music is sung in the background, like in Toy Story, with the exception of birds singing as a mating call. Great Mouse Detective attempts to have it both ways, with the diegetic songs Let Me Be Good to You and Goodbye So Soon, but also the random villain production number, The World's Greatest Criminal Mind. Now, before you get the pitchforks and torches, I think the song is fantastic, and the fact they've never used it in a live Disney show is absolutely, well, criminal. But why doesn't Basil have a similar song where he tells the audience about his hopes and dreams? Well, unfortunately in 1986, Disney seemed to have forgotten that. Or at least that's what the documentary of Howard Ashman would indicate, because he had to bring up this forgotten musical knowledge about getting a character to sing their wants, and even had to fight to avoid having part of your world cut from The Little Mermaid. All because Katzenberg allegedly saw some kids getting restless at a screening. Can't have Johnny fidgeting for 2 seconds. Speaking of music, supposedly Katzenberg also suggested that Michael Jackson write the song for the nightclub scene. That would have been interesting.
Boys, what you hoping for will come true. Let me be good to you.
And again, not saying the songs are bad at all. I think they're great, but they don't really advance the story and aren't suitable pop songs for the radio. No earworms here. Nowhere near the mileage of the classics. As I stated earlier, Basil doesn't really have much of an arc. He begins a determined detective, and he ends a determined detective. The only thing he learns is he should trust himself more, that having a partner around that doesn't do much makes for good marketing. And addressing that relationship directly, what exactly is the motivation for these two to get together? Unlike compelling enemies to friends plots like Toy Story, they start out more or less as neutral and end up as warm acquaintances. They don't really learn much from each other. In a typical compelling plot, you have a protagonist, a character who wants something, an antagonist, a character that is the biggest stumbling block to their want, a mentor that helps the character make the change they need to get past the antagonist, and a distraction that leads the protagonist down the wrong path. In the case of Great Mouse Detective, the protagonist Basil wants to defeat Ratigan. Dawson plays a bit of a mentor role in that he yells at Basil at the end to believe in himself, but that's not something Basil struggled with until 2 seconds ago. There really isn't a wrong way of going about things represented by a character. This makes the whole film feel more like an episodic situation rather than a story with weight and consequence. Compare this to something like Toy Story, where Woody's ambition to be Andy's favorite toy is actually a bit self-centered, and Buzz Lightyear acts like the antagonist, the biggest obstacle to being Andy's favorite toy. Ultimately, Bo Peep has to explain to Woody that Andy will always be there for him, and Sid acts as the personification of Woody's worst impulses. That destroying Buzz Lightyear is a way to solve his problem. Anyway, what I'm saying is friendship stories can be done well, but Great Mouse Detective tacks on a friendship story onto a mystery that doesn't require it. Well, mystery? Animated films are interesting ducks, in that they represent a certain vibe more than a specific genre. You'll find multiple genres within the Disney canon, from romance to adventure to The Great Mouse Detective. Now, with its salute to Sherlock Holmes, it's a mystery, right? Except when you think of a classic mystery, you think of the basic elements such as a puzzle to solve, a sense of justice to be restored. There really isn't a puzzle to be solved in The Great Mouse Detective. We know the villain is Ratigan from the beginning. The only thing Basil has to figure out is where he's hiding. Hardly some exciting thing for the audience to solve. Contrast that with Encanto, a movie in the gothic mystery genre where Maribel realizes she's at the center of why the magic is fading, and that ultimately the grandmother is causing rifts in the family. You know, revelations that matter. Not the fact that Ratigan's home is underneath the snuggly mouseling. In many ways, the story is more like the thriller genre, except it's missing any sort of plot twists or wrought tension. Is it a cozy thriller? Is that a thing? As far as a sense of justice, well, we certainly are upset that Olivia's father was kidnapped. There's a reason why mysteries tend to be centered around murder. And that's because, well, there isn't much you can do to restore justice more than avenging a death. But again, I'm not suggesting that Basil's wife... Okay, fine, maybe I am suggesting it. And all his kids, too. Finding Nemo, this thing. Just because there are identifiable reasons why the movie doesn't soar on the level of the classics doesn't mean there aren't some great attributes. So, let's discuss the top 10 really quickly. Ratigan's amazing, like some of the best performances in vocal acting, courtesy of the great Vincent Price, and animation, courtesy of Glenn Keane. Of course, that's not a shock, since Keane would go on to animate Ariel and The Beast, and he's basically the Denzel Washington of animation actors. Songs, already mentioned, are great, particularly The World's Greatest Criminal Mind, non-diegeticness and all. Dumbo makes a random cameo appearance, and Bill from Alice in Wonderland. From chimney sweeper to insurrectionist, always the quiet ones. Again, the lack of romance was intriguingly novel and noteworthy. Henry Mancini's score is fantastic. The escape from Ratigan's trap is a delectable Rube Goldberg machine. Toby is plenty cute, and it's greatly unfair that he gets neglected when people do montages of Disney dogs. Looking at you, Internet. The humor is really sharp throughout. You can tell these creators would go on to work on Mermaid and Aladdin. And the pacing is tight. There's not really any boring scene. The movie just breezes by. All in all, the movie is pretty good. And I think that's mostly the issue. The Disney animated films are quite strong and powerful stories, some of the most memorable out of Hollywood, so a pretty good Disney movie is just going to flounder. That being said, it does have its dedicated fan base, and I think it's for these distinctive elements that I discussed. Veering from the typical winning formula was risky, and it didn't quite pay off, but it does make an interesting addition to the Disney canon. So yeah, The Great Mouse Detective may not be perfect, but it's a unique and charming film that deserves some more love. It's a reminder that even in the shadow of giants like Sherlock Holmes, a little mouse can still leave a big impression.